The first tactic is to send a member up the vessel's anchor chain. Carrier crew members respond by pulling out the fire hoses. Soon the arrests begin, first with the man on the anchor chain, then a member chained to a ladder on the stern of the ship, and 4 people in a Zodiac who have been spray painting the vessel.
100 nuclear warheads. All nuclear weapons are a threat to humanity, and we demand that these warheads be taken out of Canadian territory.
Greenpeace says their message is getting out. They'll keep up their protests, and more Canadians should join in.
I think the Americans have got the message because they're very secretive about their visits now. Sometimes they come in at night, and they are no longer inform us when they're coming. They're aware that people of Vancouver don't want to see them here.
The Zodiacs circle the ship one last time and get yet another soaking from the crew and then head off. They say every time the federal government lets an American warship in, it's a slap on the face of Vancouver residents.
A Soviet freighter loaded with Canadian peace release linking the shipment to 3,600 metric tons leaked from a warehouse fire in Saint-Basile-le-Grand last summer. A flotilla of Greenpeace members met the ship yesterday to protest its arrival.
Greenpeace originally planned to block the freighter from docking, but the Port Authority announced it would not allow the hazardous cargo off the ship, a decision made in response to public and environmental concerns. Union dock workers also refused to handle the cargo. So the protesters simply attached a banner to the side of the vessel and followed it to port, happy the cargo would not be unloaded and that they'd drawn attention to Britain's import of toxic waste.
We wouldn't like to see them moving on the high seas at all. What we'd really like to see is for them to stay in their countries of origin in above-ground monitorable storage.
The ship carried 1 container of hazardous waste, including 3 barrels of liquid and a transformer contaminated with PCBs from Quebec Hydro. Despite the sudden attention, this shipment was routine. Quebec Hydro has been shipping waste with PCBs to Britain for 2 years. The protest follows anger over another consignment of PCB-contaminated waste from Canada. Starting next week, 15,000 tons of old electrical equipment from the Saint-Basile-le-Grand fire will be shipped to Britain from Montreal. The container of waste on this ship is being returned to Canada. Greenpeace hopes it will be the last one sent here.
The giant vessel as it anchored. One protester spent 20 minutes clinging to the anchor chain, while others spray-painted symbols on the vessel. The carrier and its 4 support ships will be in Vancouver until Sunday, and Greenpeace says it will return. This morning's activities resulted in the arrests of 6 people. And in Britain, Greenpeace protesters tried unsuccessfully to prevent a ship from docking in Tilbury today. The boat was carrying PCB waste from a Quebec textile plant. But after Greenpeace draped its banners on the ship, dock workers refused to unload the toxic cargo. And the Quebec company says it has no choice but to take the PCB container back. It's not the first time PCBs have been sent to Britain for disposal, but British politicians have called for a halt to the practice. Strong winds and the threat of thunderstorms forced marathon swimmer Vicky Keith to delay today's scheduled crossing.
But when it tied up at Tilbury docks, downriver from London, authorities wouldn't allow it to be unloaded. Gillian Finley reports.
The 6 tons of Canadian PCBs arrived at dawn aboard a Russian freighter. Last night, port authorities at Tilbury told the freighter its toxic cargo would not be welcome. And this morning, members of the environmental group Greenpeace were on hand to reinforce the point. As they unfurled their skull and crossbones, Greenpeace claimed it was staking a new issue here. Currently, Britain imports and destroys more than 70,000 tons of toxic chemicals a year. Environmentalists say it has to end.
But the whole importation of toxic waste into the United Kingdom should stop. We shouldn't be the world's dumping ground for their toxic material that they're not willing to deal with themselves.
Apparently, the Port of Tilbury agrees. Today's PCB shipment met all Canadian and British regulations, but the port says it has a policy of not handling toxic waste, and it wasn't prepared to breach it.
It isn't a fear. We believe these containers probably are very safely packed. The cargo is in there properly stowed, but we just do not want to handle this material because of the public concern.
And that concern is real. This morning, people living near the port were glad the shipment had been refused. If Canada is going to produce PCBs, they said, Canada must learn to dispose of them herself.
Well, what do you think we're supposed to do with it then? You asked yourself a question there. Ask yourself a question there.
Sure, Canada's as rich as England, but I don't think this country's rich, so why can't you make your own plant? Wouldn't cost too much, would it, really?
After unloading its non-toxic cargo, port officials say the freighter will return to Canada and the PCBs will go with it. What is unclear is what will happen to future shipments. Gillian Finley, CBC News, London.
A ship with a similar cargo is due to arrive in Liverpool next week. It's carrying the first of 15 loads of PCB-contaminated oil from the fire in Saint-Basile-le-Grand in Quebec. But port authorities in Liverpool now say they won't allow any PCB material ashore either. However, Premier Bourassa said today that he has guarantees that the PCB cargo will be allowed to land in some British port. A New Zealand rescue team.
Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev is enjoying his summer vacation right now, but when he gets back, one of the new problems he may face is a fledgling but growing anti-nuclear movement. Behind the fence, in the distance, is probably the most secret city in the Soviet Union, Kurchatov, home for the nuclear weapons factories and the hundreds of atomic scientists who make them. That's what these people are angry about. Some 7,000 Kazakhs and so-called White Russians came here for what's said to be the Soviet Union's first anti-nuclear demonstration, right on the edge of the top-secret nuclear zone. Those most affected are the Kazakhs who live here, many descendants of Genghis Khan's conquering Mongol horde. Today, they live in fear of the next nuclear test. This old woman says she's seen dozens of tests, and the radiation level in the area is dangerously high. People from the area marched across the desert to join the demonstrators, and here speakers from Moscow condemn nuclear weapons testing. They issued an appeal for Presidents Bush and Gorbachev to join together to end the nuclear arms race. Bill McLaughlin, CBS News, Moscow.
6 people have been arrested at a Greenpeace demonstration outside Vancouver Harbor. They've been charged with mischief. The protesters had surrounded an American aircraft carrier capable of carrying nuclear weapons. They began painting the international radiation symbol on the ship, then climbing it. That's when the American crew reacted by spraying water hoses. Greenpeace said today's protest won't be its last. The USS Independence is scheduled to remain in Vancouver's English Bay until Sunday. Impact.
They were protesting the fact the ship would not declare itself nuclear-free. One Greenpeacer climbed aboard the ship's anchor, while others spent some time painting radiation symbols on the vessel. The Navy turned the fire hoses on the group, and 6 of the protesters were arrested when they arrived back on shore.
Try and get all the way down there this time.
And a Greenpeace protest in England today was much more effective, successfully turning away a shipment of Canadian toxic waste. A Soviet freighter arrived in Tilbury, England this morning, carrying 7 drums of PCBs, the polychlorinated biphenyls from Dominion textile plants in Quebec. The company has a contract with an incinerator in Wales to dispose of the PCBs. But the British chapter of Greenpeace was out to greet the freighter with the customary protest, buzzing the big ships in the Zodiacs and hanging signs on the freighter's side. The protest worked. British dock workers and the Tilbury Port Authority refused to allow the waste to be unloaded. Later, authorities in Liverpool said they wouldn't accept the shipment either. This is the 5th time Dominion Textiles has shipped PCBs to Britain, but the first time they've been turned back. The company now says it has little choice but to take back the PCBs.
Serious and dangerous. Today, Greenpeace members were back in their Zodiacs and back in trouble. A U.S. aircraft carrier was heading into Vancouver Harbor, and Greenpeace was heading out to confront it because they said it could be carrying nuclear weapons. The crew members on board the USS Independence were not amused, and before the confrontation was over, 6 protesters had been arrested.
In the quiet of the early morning, as most of the city still sleeps, Greenpeace prepares for war. With 4 Zodiacs, 2 boats, and 20 protesters, it'll take on the American Navy.
this is it's maybe a long path, but I believe that the people of New Zealand have managed to stop all nuclear weapons coming into their country, and I believe we can do the same in Canada, and this is part of that process.
The small armada charges out into English Bay. As an outline of the American warship USS Independence looms on the horizon. Commissioned 30 years ago, the Independence has served in the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam, and various peacekeeping operations. It has 5,200 crew members. One of the ship's 50 aircraft hovers as a Zodiac taunts the 80,000-ton vessel as it lumbers through the water. Soon it drops anchor and police are ready for what's to come.
We want the other people of Vancouver to do whatever they can, whatever it might be, to stop these things coming in. It's just too disgusting to accept.
You have nuclear bombs on board. Vancouver is a nuclear weapons-free zone. Please turn around and leave our harbor right now.
The first tactic is to climb the anchor chain. A protester hangs there 20 minutes while crew members on the carrier fight back with fire hoses. The arrests begin with the protester on the anchor chain, another padlocked to a ladder on the stern. In all, 6 are charged with mischief, including 4 in a Zodiac.
This ship is armed with 100 nuclear warheads. All nuclear weapons are a threat to humanity, and we demand that these warheads be taken out of Canadian territory.
Greenpeace will protest again and says more Canadians should join in because they are getting out the message.
I think the Americans have got the message because they're very secretive about their visits now. Sometimes they come in at night and they are no longer inform us when they're coming. They're aware that the people of Vancouver don't want to see them here.
The Zodiacs circle the ship one last time, get another soaking, and leave. Protesters say every time American ships carry nuclear weapons into the harbor, it's a slap on the face of all Vancouver residents.
Greenpeace is finding much greater success in Britain, where today a second port has refused to accept a shipment of PCBs from Canada. The toxic waste is from the warehouse fire last summer in Saint-Basile-le-Grand, Quebec. And British port authorities and union leaders are now refusing to handle it. Their apparent change of heart follows some typical Greenpeace maneuvers.
Greenpeace protesters raced along the River Thames to meet the freighter early this morning. Aboard it, 1 container of hazardous cargo from Hydro-Quebec. The cargo includes waste contaminated with PCBs, which can cause cancer and liver disease. Hydro-Quebec has been shipping toxic waste to Britain for 2 years. The protesters' message, take it back to Canada.
We wouldn't like to see them moving on the high seas at all. What we'd really like to see is for them to stay in their countries of origin in above-ground monitorable storage.
Greenpeace's demand was met even before members manned their inflatables. The Tilbury Port Authority refused to allow the container or any future shipments of PCBs to be unloaded. The Tilbury decision was made in response to widespread protest, and it was followed by an announcement in Liverpool that the port there will stop handling PCBs. Next week, Liverpool was to begin receiving 15 shipments of waste contaminated with PCBs from the Saint-Basile-le-Grand fire.
We don't see why this country should take other people's industrial waste, especially a country like Canada, which is vast tracts of land, less people on it.
The Liverpool decision also delighted residents in Pontypool, Wales, home to one of 3 facilities in Britain licensed to incinerate PCBs. The plant there was contracted to take the waste from Saint-Basile-le-Grand, arousing deep anger.
This country of ours has such lax rules on its imports. It seems to me that provided you've got a label on it, then you can bring it in. And we just don't want it here.
While protesters consider toxic waste imports a threat, Britain's disposal industry says it's doing the world a favor.
The UK is fortunate at the moment that we have facilities which can handle particularly awkward wastes. Other countries in the world do not have these facilities and are unlikely to have them in the near future.
Toxic waste imports to Britain have increased more than 20-fold since 1981. The Port Authority's decisions could change that trend and force Canada to dispose of its toxic waste at home.
The BC government may be asked to put in a Soviet freighter transporting it from Montreal. And now the deadly chemical is expected to be shipped back to Canada tomorrow morning. The CBC's Gillian Findlay reports from London.
The Soviet freighter Kudazhnik Syryan sailed up the Thames at dawn this morning, carrying 12 tons of toxic PCBs, chemicals from Canada destined for a British incinerator. But no sooner had the ship arrived when it was met by a flotilla from the environment group Greenpeace. Their angry British disposal companies have been importing deadly waste from around the world, 80,000 tons last year. They say it has to end.
But the whole importation of toxic waste into the United Kingdom should stop. We shouldn't be the world's dumping ground for their toxic material that they're not willing to deal with themselves.
Today, the port bowed to public pressure. Even though the shipment met all Canadian and British regulations, the freighter was not allowed to unload the PCBs. Port authorities said the contaminated waste would be returned to Canada.
It isn't a fear. We believe these containers probably are very safely packed. The cargo is in there properly stowed. But we just do not want to handle this material because of the public concern.
The PCBs may be on their way home, but environmentalists here say it's not the end of their campaign against foreign waste. Next week, the first of 15 loads of PCBs from last summer's warehouse fire in Saint-Basile-le-Grand are scheduled to arrive. The Quebec waste is headed for the countryside of southeast Wales and this incineration plant. The company and the British government maintain the plant is state-of-the-art with the best of pollution controls. But the people who live in this valley aren't convinced. They blame emissions for health problems and they want the shipment stopped.
This country of ours has such lax rules on its imports. It seems to me that provided you've got a label on it, then you can bring it in. And we just don't want it here.
And now, neither does the Liverpool dock that was to take the Saint-Basile waste. This afternoon, the company that runs the dock said, like the port at Tilbury, it will refuse to accept any more foreign PCBs. So, toxic cargoes from Canada face an uncertain future here. Tomorrow morning, the Kudazhnik Syryan will begin its journey back to Montreal, still carrying its load of PCBs, not sure how or where it will finally get rid of them. Gillian Findlay, CBC News, London.
Here at home, there's still no...
Setting the date, a September election is called in Quebec. And on the Journal, a tax survival guide, how to get ready for Michael Wilson's new system, and the rigors of boot camp, tough treatment in a Florida prison. The National with Peter Mansbridge.
Good evening. It's a cargo no one wants. A shipment of toxic waste from Canada. It's on a ship in a British harbor tonight, but it won't get any closer to British soil. A port just east of London has refused to accept the cargo, contaminated PCBs from a company in Quebec. The freighter is being told to leave, but as Gillian Findlay reports, what happens next is unclear.
The Soviet freighter Kudazhnik Syryan sailed up the Thames at dawn this morning, carrying 12 tons of toxic PCBs, chemicals from Canada destined for a British incinerator. But no sooner had the ship arrived when it was met by a flotilla from the environment group Greenpeace. Their angry British disposal companies have been importing deadly waste from around the world, 80,000 tons last year. They say it has to end.
But the whole importation of toxic waste into the United Kingdom should stop. We shouldn't be the world's dumping ground for their toxic material that they're not willing to deal with themselves.
Today, the port bowed to public pressure. Even though the shipment met all Canadian and British regulations, the freighter was not allowed to unload the PCBs. Port authorities said the contaminated waste would be returned to Canada.
It isn't a fear. We
the anchoring of a U.S. aircraft carrier. The protesters sailed into English Bay to intercept the USS Independence. In rafts and small boats, they swarmed around the carrier, and when they painted the peace symbol on the hull, the Americans doused them with fire hoses. Greenpeace says it wanted to show that nuclear warships are not welcome here. The carrier is scheduled to stay in Vancouver until Sunday. There's going to be an election in Quebec, and it's going
Date about how the new federal tax will affect BC housing. Join us at 11 after the Journal.
Tomorrow night we'll be reporting on the inquiry in Nepal, Manitoba into the murder of Helen Betty Osborne. Almost 18 years after her death, the case is now being re-examined. The inquiry is raising questions about how the Cree teenager died.
Abbotsford Air Show.
And in sports tonight.
Good evening. Greenpeace was out in force today, and once again the environmental group was battling an old enemy, the U.S. Navy. As usual, it was an unequal battle as a flotilla of inflatable Zodiacs took on a massive aircraft carrier. But despite that and the failure of numerous other protests to stop American warships visiting Vancouver, it was clear that Greenpeace is not about to give up. Paul Heaney reports.
With the sun streaking through a gunmetal gray sky, Greenpeace headed out to sea. Its target, the USS Independence, a Forester-class aircraft carrier with a crew of 3,000. Greenpeace claims the Independence carries nuclear weapons. The U.S. Navy will neither confirm nor deny this.
I'll tell you why we're here. Look at this thing. This is one of those evil things that's ever been invented.
As the Independence slows to anchor in English Bay, Greenpeace launches its first salvo. The Navy fights fire with water. A Vancouver police boat moves in and arrests the protester. Minutes later, a second protester chains himself to the carrier's stern. While this is going on, another Greenpeace crew spray paints the port gunwale. This draws the wrath of many sailors, some of whom will undoubtedly be assigned to scrape off the paint. The four aboard the Greenpeace Zodiac are arrested.
Canada is officially a nuclear weapons-free country.
The man chained to the stern is cut down by a Ports Canada crew who just happened to have a pair of bolt cutters. In all, 6 people are arrested and charged with mischief. Greenpeace spokesman Simon Waters says it was worth it.
This ship is an absolutely disgusting monstrosity. We came here to show our opposition. We're prepared to do this, and we want the people of Vancouver to do whatever they feel appropriate to stop these ships. People don't want them here. Let's look at this bloody thing. It has 100 nuclear weapons on board. Each of those nuclear weapons is 100 times more powerful than the bomb that we dropped on Nagasaki 44 years ago today.
The protest now over, Greenpeace makes a final circle around the Independence. The ship's crew responds with a salute. Paul Heaney, CBC News, Vancouver.
In a second separate demonstration in downtown Vancouver today, another group of protesters were upset about one of the province's most popular summer events. They were concerned that the Abbotsford Air Show has become a showcase for military hardware, and that, they say, should stop.
We have captured their crews, terrorized caraboos, and we won't be the 51st day.
6 tons of PCBs. It was aboard a Soviet freighter, one of the few willing to handle the toxic chemicals. The rejection of the container has led to a lot of concern. Cal Barton reports.
Greenpeace protesters raced along the River Thames to meet the freighter early this morning. Aboard it, 1 container of hazardous cargo from Hydro-Quebec. The cargo includes waste contaminated with PCBs, which can cause cancer and liver disease. Hydro-Quebec has been shipping toxic waste to Britain for 2 years. The protesters' message, take it back to Canada.
We wouldn't like to see them moving on the high seas at all. What we'd really like to see is for them to stay in their countries of origin in above-ground monitorable storage.
Greenpeace's demand was met even before members manned their inflatables. The Tilbury Port Authority refused to allow the container or any future shipments of PCBs to be unloaded. The Tilbury decision was made in response to widespread protest, and it was followed by an announcement in Liverpool that the port there will stop handling PCBs. Next week, Liverpool was to begin receiving 15 shipments of waste contaminated with PCBs from the Saint-Basile-le-Grand fire.
We don't see why this country should take other people's industrial waste, especially a country like Canada, which is vast tracts of land.
The Liverpool decision also delighted residents in Pontypool, Wales.
Minister Bill McKnight, but some Vancouverites think differently. Demonstrators say the visiting American warship USS Independence carrying up to 100 nuclear warheads, and this morning they took to the waters of English Bay in a new type of anti-nuclear protest.
So one of the guys.
They've come to express opposition to nuclear weapons. 30 people turn out for an early morning protest arranged by a swim coach who spends a lot of her time in these waters.
On Wednesday morning, early in the morning, I was with a group of swimmers swimming at Kitts Beach, and the ship was already here. It had just come in the night, and yeah, it's the sight of it is pretty upsetting.
No members actually took part, but Greenpeace ferries the protesters out to the USS Independence.
We ask you to leave our harbor right now. We're not against Americans. We're against the nuclear bombs that you bring into our harbor.
Instead of buzzing the vessel with Zodiacs, these protesters take to the water in a protest swim around the 1,000-foot-long ship, white peace balloons bobbing alongside of them.
Vancouver is a nuclear weapons-free zone. You have nuclear bombs on board. We ask you to leave our harbor right now.
In the orange cap is Vancouver Alderman Libby Davies. One sailor isn't amused.
See you in hell, my friend. Below you will find. Think your country. Go to hell, my friend. See you in hell.
This kind of action, along with all the other actions that take place around the world, help change the attitudes of political leaders, and that's what we're trying to do. I mean, that's how disarmament has begun.
We've got to make them aware that this is not really the solution, anyhow. That people are going to protest things like this.
I want to live, and I want my kids to live.
It's not worth it.
It's a peaceful event, no police, no arrests. Within 20 minutes, it's back to shore.
Here you go, Tiki.
Oh, thank you. Can I have a big hug?
The Hollyburn shuttles crew members from ship to shore during the stay. Sailors say Vancouver stages the most energetic protests, but they don't mind.
The crew is looking forward, and is still looking forward for a real good little port like Vancouver. They all got a chuckle out of it. Everybody wanted to go up there and see them because it was something new, all right? And we were just having fun too.
But as far as climbing up the anchor chains and things like that, that's just very unsafe. And we try to encourage people not to do that by spraying a little water down there and keeping them off.
On Sunday, the Independence heads home to San Diego.
Alderman Libby Davies has dried off since this morning's chilly swim to join us now in the studio.
Hi.
How was the swim?
Well, I really enjoyed it. It was a really unique experience, and it was really very special being with a bunch of people, swimmers, good swimmers, who got together really on one day's notice and decided that we were going to go in the ocean together and swim around the USS Independence.
You talked about it as a way to get the government going. You have to start somewhere. Do you really think things like this make any difference?
Yes, I do. I don't think that any one action in and of itself will do anything, but I think that sustained campaigns and public pressure over the long term really does bring about a very significant change. There's no doubt in my mind that if it hadn't have been for the huge peace movements around the world, we wouldn't now have disarmament agreements on land-based missiles. And the fact is that the whole issue of nuclear weapons on ships going across oceans and being in ports is really another major issue that needs to be dealt with, and it's going to take a lot of pressure and public protest from ordinary people.
Well, I know City Council has voted to declare Vancouver's port a nuclear weapons-free zone, but you can't do that without the government doing it, and the government doesn't appear to be doing that.
Well, I think that's the other major thing with this issue is that we're really dealing with our own federal government. The city of Vancouver is a nuclear weapons-free zone, but our jurisdiction does not extend to the port. Now, most people would think of the port as part of the city, and of course it is, but legally it's under federal jurisdiction. So Vancouver City Council and lots of groups in the city of Vancouver have been urging the federal government to listen to the people of Vancouver, who are simply saying, we're not opposed to Americans, we just don't want to see nuclear weapons on these vessels.
These ships come here, it's part of NATO, and we have commitments to NATO.
No, it's not. It's not part of any defense agreement. They are here for rest and relaxation. And even if it were
part of the NATO exercise, in the sense that we have agreements with them for certain things, and if they come up here and say, like you say, rest and relaxation, how can we turn them away?
You see, I don't personally have a problem with the American Navy coming to Vancouver, and I don't object to the sailors being in the city of Vancouver. The issue is the weapons that are on board. And I think it's really interesting that when the Soviets and the Americans agreed to visit each other's ports, if you remember, there were news stories about...
Bill McKnight says that's not true, though. You're telling me
they agreed to leave their weapons at home.
He says that's not been confirmed.
Well, I don't know, but that's what we heard, that agreement was being worked out. And I thought, well, that's incredible. When they visit each other's ports, they're willing to leave weapons at home.
What else would you plan for the USS Independence? Is this it?
For me, probably this is it. I'm going on a Greenpeace boat tonight. They're having an alternate reception because the USS Independence is holding a reception. But I do believe that there'll be still growing public concern and protest against the visits of nuclear-capable warships. And I've been very involved in that. And this was just sort of a personal thing I did today because I swim. And I thought, well, I can put my swimming to good use.
Thank you, Alderman Davies, for coming and talking to us today. The emergency department at St. Paul's Hospital has been plagued with nurses' resignations. And if
Well, today another 30 people entered the fray with a protest marathon swim aimed at forcing the Independence out of Vancouver Harbor. Deborah Goebel has the story.
USS Independence, please leave right now. You have nuclear bombs on board. Vancouver is a nuclear weapons-free zone. We're not against Americans, we're against nuclear weapons.
Those guys have got avgas and jet fuel and rocket fuel and high explosives and nuclear weapons on board that craft. What made you do it?
Just concerned, you know, that just let Ottawa know that there's certain people here.
The swimmers were protesting the nuclear weapons capabilities of the Independence while it visits Vancouver, a nuclear-free city. Alderman Libby Davies was one of the swimmers taking part.
How was it?
Well, it was really good being with a group of committed, great swimmers. It was the people against the weapons, the nuclear weapons. I had a good time.
It sure is different looking at it from the water up. It's a pretty scary looking thing.
Peace! Come on, they did it once.
The USS Independence is a Forrestal-class aircraft carrier with a complement of 44 aircraft and 6 Sea King helicopters. According to Greenpeace, the vessel stores nuclear bombs for use by the attack aircraft on board. It also holds nuclear depth charges for anti-submarine warfare. Aircraft carriers usually carry about 100 nuclear weapons. The City of Vancouver has passed a motion asking the federal government to declare the Port of Vancouver a nuclear-free zone.
As most of you know, another marathon swim took
claim of 100 nuclear warheads on board is true. That's classified information. So classified, even most of the crew don't know for sure.
Government action comes on the heels of a story here on News Center last November and repeated complaints by Lower Mainland environmentalists. Rod Mickleborough reports.
Last November 25th, the News Center reported that water the color of beer was spilling out of Woodfiber's waste dump and into Howe Sound. The video was shown to an official in the BC Environment Ministry. Today, the government laid a dozen pollution charges against Western Pulp Incorporated, which owns the Woodfiber pulp mill.
We consider them to be fairly serious charges. You know, under the Waste Management Act as it stood when these, you know, during the times these violations occurred, each charge carries a fine of between $0 and $50,000 upon conviction at the discretion of a provincial court judge.
The charges are the most ever laid at one time against a BC pulp mill. They involve 9 charges of exceeding the toxic levels allowed by the company's waste management permit, and 3 charges of violating the Fisheries Act by dumping harmful substances into Howe Sound.
To determine over a 96-hour period what the mortality rate is to the fish to determine how toxic the material is.
Was it very toxic?
I don't have the exact figures. I can't tell you how toxic it was, but obviously it was toxic enough to support prosecution.
Keep the pollution within your own fences.
Environmentalists have been calling on Woodfiber to clean up its act for years, and Howe Sound has been closed to fishing several times because of unacceptable levels of toxic dioxins in the water.
We're crab fishermen. It affects our livelihood. They close it down for pollution. What are we going to do?
But even though the provincial government has admitted that the company regularly exceeded pollution levels, there had never been any major charges laid until now. Greenpeace says these charges are nothing to sneeze at.
A lot of these mills are producing pulp worth $1 million per day, so 50,000, even though it seems a lot to us, really is not a lot to a mill. But if you really would be convicted for 12 charges times 50,000, you come to over $500,000. That's quite substantial.
Company officials said they have been instructed by their lawyer to make no public comment about the charges. The company is scheduled to make its first court appearance September the 12th. Rod Mickleborough, CBC News, Vancouver.
Early this morning, a group of Vancouver swimmers launched a peaceful protest against the presence of the USS Independence in English Bay. Greenpeacers were on hand, though they were not directly involved in organizing the demonstration. The swimmers were athletes, lifeguards, and concerned citizens.
I'll be back in a little while.
The swimmers met at Jericho Beach, where they were loaded onto boats provided by Greenpeace. The sun still hadn't come up as the group made its way toward English Bay. Greenpeace provided the transportation and the moral support. The tiny crafts were dwarfed by the ominous aircraft carrier, but the swimmers were undaunted.
Vancouver is a nuclear weapons-free zone. You have nuclear weapons on board. Please leave right now.
And the swim had begun. It wasn't a marathon, and it wasn't a race. It was a group of people out to make a point. They're upset at seeing a warship in Vancouver Harbour, and they're disappointed with Ottawa's failure to respond to Vancouver City Council's resolution to make the city a nuclear-free zone. Some of the crew members watched on, seemingly unimpressed by the effort. Among the swimmers was a local politician, Vancouver Alderman Libby Davies.
The presence of this huge carrier and all that it represents, its military might, the weapons that it is no doubt carrying on board, I think, you know, it's just a violation of the feeling that people in Vancouver have.
The entire flotilla circled the vessel one more time before heading home. The Independence, meantime, will be lifting anchor and powering up on Sunday. She'll head back to home base in San Diego. Coming up later...
The Abbotsford Air Show is underway again in British Columbia, offering all kinds of flying machines, old and new. This is its 28th year, and there's a new twist. A high-tech trade fair is part of the event this time. Canadian wares are on exhibit, and that brought out the Prime Minister. Craig Oliver reports.
The U.S. Air Force Thunderbirds are accustomed to being the stars of international air shows. But this year in Abbotsford, they're fighting a losing PR battle with their Soviet adversaries. Who would ever have believed the latest Soviet frontline fighters, once shrouded in secrecy, would not only be on display, but up for sale? The first MiG-29 ever to visit North America is the star attraction here, as is the Russian transport, the AN-225, the biggest aircraft in the world. In the age of glasnost, Russia's top guns do their stuff for the cameras. And perestroika means Soviet salesmen are giving their wares the best sales pitch, just like capitalists.
Yes, we have the concrete, exact, precise proposals from the Canadian companies. Now the stage of negotiation is there.
The Abbotsford Air Show, now in its 28th year, has become, organizers say, the biggest thing of its kind on the continent. 300,000 people will attend the three-day event this year. Kids love it. They can try out the cockpit of a B-1 bomber or sit in the pilot's seat of a deadly helicopter gunship. But Abbotsford is also becoming serious business. Prime Minister Mulroney is here because in the last year, a major aeronautical trade show has been added to it. High-tech equipment from around the world is on display. In opening the air show, Mulroney emphasized its importance to the aerospace industry.
This industry is building challenging and stimulating jobs for our children in both English and French-speaking Canada. This is an industry that benefits all of Canada.
The Prime Minister and his son Nicholas spent the day rubbernecking the flying circus from the stands, which included lots of U.S. warplanes. But during his BC trip, Mulroney chose to cancel a planned visit to the U.S. aircraft carrier Independence, visiting Vancouver Harbor. Members of the Vancouver City Council and of Greenpeace were protesting the visit of the nuclear carrier. Clearly, the Prime Minister's image makers didn't relish a run-in with them. Craig Oliver, CTV News, in Vancouver.
Protesters have not given up trying to turn away a visiting U.S. warship from English Bay. But today their tactics turned tame and symbolic. As the USS Independence sat idle in port, a group of about 30 people, including a city politician, gathered on shore. Like Greenpeace, they are opposed to nuclear-capable vessels in local waters. And so they dressed for a rather chilly dip in the salt chuck.
They've come to express opposition to nuclear weapons. 30 people turn out for an early morning protest arranged by a swim coach who spends a lot of her time in these waters.
On Wednesday morning, early in the morning, I was with a group of swimmers swimming at Kitts Beach, and the ship was already here. It had just come in the night, and yeah, the sight of it is pretty upsetting.
No members actually took part, but Greenpeace ferries the protesters out to the USS Independence.
We ask you to leave our harbor right now. We're not against Americans. We're against the nuclear bombs that you bring into our harbor.
Instead of buzzing the vessel with Zodiacs, these protesters take to the water in a protest swim around the 1,000-foot-long ship, white peace balloons bobbing alongside of them.
Vancouver is a nuclear weapons-free zone. You have nuclear bombs on board. We ask you to leave our harbor right now.
In the orange cap is Vancouver Alderman Libby Davies. One sailor isn't amused.
You would help, my friend.
This kind of action, along with all the other actions that take place around the world, help change the attitudes of political leaders, and that's what we're trying to do. I mean, that's how disarmament has begun.
We've got to make them aware that this is not really the solution, anyhow, that people are going to protest things like this.
I want to live and I want my kids to live.
It's not worth it.
It's a peaceful event, no police, no arrests. Within 20 minutes, it's back to shore.
Here you go, Tiki.
Oh, thank you. Can I have a big hug?
The Hollyburn shuttles crew members from ship to shore during their stay here. The sailors say Vancouver stages the most energetic protests of any port they visit.
The crew is looking forward, and is still looking forward for a real good liberty port like Vancouver. They all got a chuckle out of it. Everybody wanted to go up there and see them because it was something new, all right? And we were just having fun too.
As far as climbing up the anchor chains and things like that, that's just very unsafe. And we try to encourage people not to do that by spraying a little water down there and keeping them off.
When the Independence leaves on Sunday, no one will be certain that the protesters' claim of 100 nuclear warheads on board is true. That's classified information. So classified, even most of the crew don't know for sure.
An American aircraft carrier, Independence, was harassed by protesters tonight. Once again, a flotilla of small boats set out against the American Navy. Among them was NDP MP Sven Robinson.
I'm here because the government of Canada, our Conservative government, has refused to respect the will of the people of this community of Vancouver, who've said very clearly through our council that we don't want nuclear weapons in our port, we don't want nuclear weapons in our city.
The protest continued until later in the evening. Early this morning, another group of protesters launched a swim-in around the big ship. The group was made up of athletes, lifeguards, and concerned citizens.
I'll be back in a little while.
The swimmers met at Jericho Beach, where they were loaded onto boats provided by Greenpeace. The sun still hadn't come up as the group made its way toward English Bay. Greenpeace provided the transportation and the moral support. The tiny crafts were dwarfed by the ominous aircraft carrier, but the swimmers were undaunted.
Vancouver is a nuclear weapons-free zone. You have nuclear weapons on board. Please leave right now.
And the swim had begun. It wasn't a marathon, and it wasn't a race. It was a group of people out to make a point. They're upset at seeing a warship in Vancouver Harbour, and they're disappointed with Ottawa's failure to respond to Vancouver City Council's resolution to make the city a nuclear-free zone. Some of the crew members watched on, seemingly unimpressed by the effort. Among the swimmers was a local politician, Vancouver Alderman Libby Davies.
The presence of this huge carrier and all that it represents, its military might, the weapons that it is no doubt carrying on board, I think, you know, it's just a violation of the feeling that people in Vancouver have.
The entire flotilla circled the vessel one more time before heading home. The Independence, meantime, will be lifting anchor and powering up on Sunday. She'll head back to home base in San Diego.
We'll have more on the Independence later when Joni Marr reports on how sailors cope with life on the ship. Coming up, Although anti-nuclear protesters see the American carrier Independence as an ominous symbol of war and death, it's a different story for the sailors who man the ship. As Joni Marr reports, life on board the ship is very much like that of a crowded small town.
The fighter jets on the USS Independence will be idle while they're in Vancouver. But during a military exercise, 90 aircraft may be practicing from the ship's flight deck, which is the size of 3 football fields laid end to end. During their 12-hour shifts, sailors constantly monitor the $20 million machines they brought to show off in Vancouver.
Well, just kind of checking the integrity of the aircraft, make sure no one's messed with it, you know, and all the panels are secure. We don't have any leaks that might cause problems on the deck. Get fuel on the deck, we may have a fire, so we're constantly watching for that.
Since the 30-year-old aircraft carrier may be out of its home port of San Diego for 7 months a year, it has to be a virtual floating city. There's a bank on board to cash paychecks, a photo lab which produces everything from publicity pictures to ID cards. The ship's print shop puts out a newspaper, internal bulletins, and instruction sheets. There's an operating room, medical and dental clinic, laundry room with specific sailors detailed to that duty. The Independence even has its own police. Just like customs officials, they check visitors for banned items like weapons and drugs.
Yeah, the flight deck will work.
Dinner is served cafeteria style for 900 sailors at a time. There are a few complaints about the food.
It ain't as good as Mom's cooking, but you know, it ain't as bad as hospital food neither. It never be like homemade. Close, but never like Mom's cooking.
You're listening to KAOS.
There's also a radio station hosted by sailors playing their requests. If it's reading you feel like, the ship's library has 10,000 books, tapes, and magazines.
It's very far in between that you find any privacy. You have to, well, like I said, the ship's library is a good place to come to, and not a lot of guys come down here, and or if you can go topside somewhere, find a moment by yourself.
If it's frustration that needs to be worked out, the ship has 2 weight rooms.
It helps eliminate some of the stress involved in day-to-day activities and working in an environment where people have to work close together, so it's important.
Sailors say life on the carrier is manageable if they think of the ship as a small town which travels from port to port and forget about how much they miss home. Joni Marr, CBC News, on the USS Independence.